Chapter 6. After supper, a meal where little was spoken, and Willard disappeared as quickly as he could, Frankie put on a large apron and did the supper dishes. Wally was saying little to her, and she didn't know how to get his mind off Reginald. When the dishes were done, she walked to him and sat down, taking his hand in hers. "I'm very sorry you found out about Reginald that way. I didn't think he'd ever show up around here. I didn't even know he knew where I was. He's definitely not the kind of man I can see a woman who knows how to mend fences marry." Frankie laughed. "Oh, never. He was always the escort of the prettiest girl in town. He was my beau for a year, but I don't think I ever really knew him. I thought I loved him, because he was what my parents wanted for me, but he wasn't really what I wanted, if that makes sense." "It makes a lot of sense to me. I guess I never really thought of you as a woman who was above me socially. And now I have to." "Why do you have to?" "I'm the woman you came here to marry. I do all the chores on my own. I don't have a maid or a cook or anyone else helping me. I'm the woman you see in front of you. There is no social class out here. There are only mountains, trees, rivers, and cattle. Together, we will turn this ranch into something that people will envy for miles around. So you don't regret marrying me?" She smiled. "No, I don't regret marrying you. I mean, I'm nervous, because I've married a man I've only known for a few days, but even if you hadn't been here, I'd never have married Reginald. He's not the right man for me. He'd never put up with my wearing breeches." Wally frowned. He didn't want to put up with her wearing breeches either. "You'll wear dresses now that we're married, right?" She shrugged. "This is the only dress I have, so probably not all the time. I need to get more fabric to make a couple more of them. And then there will always be occasions where I'm needed to do some work on the ranch. I'll have to wear pants for some things. I know you prefer me in a dress, but it won't always be feasible." "But you'll wear one as much as you can?" She nodded. "I should make a trip into town tomorrow then. If I'd known you felt so strongly about it, I'd have bought fabric for another dress today. I thought you didn't mind my breeches." He shrugged. "I don't mind them, because I recognize their necessity in the past. But not so much in the future. Yes, you'll need to wear them from time to time, but I'd rather my wife didn't run around town looking like a man." "Then I won't." It would be a hard promise to keep, but she'd do her very best. "I'll only wear them on days when I absolutely need to. And I'll get enough fabric for 2 everyday dresses tomorrow." "Can we afford that?" She nodded. "We're doing fine financially. We had some money when we came here, and the ranch is already paying for itself. I can afford to buy fabric for a couple of new dresses." She didn't tell him exactly how much money, because she knew it would shock him. She and her brother had been given money by their father to leave, and it had been a generous amount. He'd been proud they'd been willing to strike out on their own. "Then it's a good plan." He got to his feet. "Why don't you get ready for bed, while I go for a quick walk?" He was eager to get on with the wedding night. He'd waited his whole life for this. Frankie swallowed hard. This was the part of the night she was unsure about. How could she submit to a man she barely knew? "All right." Wally leaned over and kissed her softly, needing to remind himself that she was still his. Reginald hadn't changed anything. She watched him leave, and then she rushed into her bedroom, changing into her nightgown and taking her hair down. She ran her brush through it quickly, having long forgotten the 100 strokes she was supposed to give it every night according to her mother. She put it into a long braid, her fingers flying. She had no idea how much time he'd give her, and she wanted to be ensconced under the covers before he came back in. She slipped between the sheets, her arms at her side, and closed her eyes, taking deep breaths. Why this was so frightening to her, she didn't know. Her mother had never talked to her about it, but she'd had some friends who had married before she did, and they'd explained everything to her. They'd even talked as if they enjoyed it, so her fear was irrational. When Wally came into the room, he turned down the lantern and undressed in the dark. More than anything he wanted to see his bride, but by the way she was covered, he could tell she was nervous. So was he for that matter. What if he couldn't do it right? What if she didn't enjoy it? He wanted her to like it, because then she'd want to do it more. He knew he'd like it. There was no doubt about that. He slid into the bed beside her, reaching for her, but she didn't turn to him and instead stayed where she was with her arms straight at her sides. "You're going to have to cooperate for this to happen," he told her softly. "I don't know what to do." She could hear the panic in her voice as she said it, and she was ashamed. Every woman in the world went through this on their wedding night, so why did she feel like she was so different? Wally sighed, his hand stroking the arm closest to him. "I don't either, really. We'll have to figure it out together." She turned on her side facing him, trying to make out his features in the dark. "You mean you've never done it either?" "No, I haven't. Remember, no one would let me court their daughters. Besides, I was taught that making love was only allowed after marriage with your wife. I wouldn't have done it with anyone else." She reached out and stroked his cheek. "And you don't think I'm crazy for being afraid?" "Not at all. I'm pretty nervous. I mean, I understand the mechanics of it all, but what if I do it wrong? What if I don't please you?" She blinked in surprise a couple of times. "You care about pleasing me?" She'd been told that not all men did. She wished she could forget everything she knew about how this night was supposed to go and just let herself feel. "Of course I do. I want you to want to do this as much as I will. And I have a feeling I'm going to want to do it a lot." She giggled. "Well, I've heard that's true of all men." "You have?" he asked, his voice full of mock anger. "And just who have you been talking to about this?" She shrugged. "Just some friends from back home." "Do you have any female friends here?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "No, because I've had to stay in disguise for so long. I'm hoping that when we start going to church every Sunday, I'll be able to make some. I can't wait to make friends, really. I think that'll be good for you." He couldn't help but wonder if there was a doctor in town who could help her when it was time to have babies, or if they'd be on their own. Weston seemed like a tiny town with a church, a store, and little else. He gathered her close, having her rest her head on his shoulder. Maybe if they talked for a while, she'd calm down a little. "Tell me what you see for the future of the ranch," he said, stroking one arm as he snuggled her close. She sighed. "I see more the potential of family on the ranch. I want to have a dozen kids, and all of them stay right here, working to build up our home. We could turn it into a community right here. Wouldn't it be nice if we had several ranch hands, a blacksmith, and even a little general store right here on the ranch? I can almost picture it. And a chapel. Our very own chapel. Would all that make you happy?" "I don't need all that to make me happy, Wally. I'm happy just lying here with you, talking in the dark about the future. I believe that happiness comes from within. The whole thing with Reginald destroyed my ability to believe in myself for a long time. I thought that it meant that I wasn't good enough to marry. But really, it just meant that he didn't have it in him to control his lust. It had nothing to do with me at all. Never again will I let my happiness be wrapped up in things around me. It has to come from me." "And how do you make that happen?" he asked, surprised at her words. He had always looked at happiness as almost something that you absolutely couldn't control. It was something that happened because you met a goal, or because of the person who was by your side, not because it was something you just were. "It's a choice I make every day. I can wake up and think about how hard life is, or I can embrace it and be happy anyway. I wake up and I know I have to mend fences, which is my least favorite ranch chore, And I choose to be happy, because it's not something I have to do every day. Because I'm good at it, and I can get it done quickly. Because I have the full use of both of my hands and legs, and I know how to work hard. I'd rather stay in the house and bake bread all day. I love to bake bread. I love the smell of it as it's coming out of the oven. So if I have to mend fences, I can think about how much I'm really going to enjoy the next day I get to stay in the house and bake bread all day. I choose to find happiness in everything I do, instead of choosing to be sad or angry. And how did you find happiness when you saw Reginald today? She giggled. I found happiness when I saw him, because I knew that I'm not married to him. I dodged that bullet, and I'm married to a truly good man, running a ranch that I love. I'm not back in New York, trying to live up to society's expectations. He smiled. Very good answer. Your new husband approves. And I approve of my new husband. She kissed his bare shoulder softly. How did your sister come to run a mail-order bride agency? Is she married? He shook his head. No, she's not, but I think she's going to realize sooner or later what's right under her nose. Her butler, Bernard, is the perfect man for her, and I hope someday she marries him. But how did she get there? Well, our oldest sister, Susan, became a mail-order bride around 1883, I think. She moved to Fort Worth and married a rancher there. Then a couple of years later, Elizabeth, the second oldest, went into town and she ran into the matchmaker. They'd lost contact, but Elizabeth had always liked her and respected the work she did. The matchmaker was off to become a mail-order bride herself, so she asked Elizabeth to take it over. She provided her with a house, found her a butler, and everything. So Harriet moved to Seattle, and Elizabeth moved into one of the biggest homes in Beckham. It was all very strange. It sounds like it. She lightly traced a pattern on his shoulder. Are you talking to me to make me less nervous? Or have you decided we should wait before we, He smiled. I thought talking might calm you down a bit. Were you hoping I'd decided to wait? She shook her head. No, but I'm feeling much calmer, and I think if we're going to try to do this thing, we should maybe get going with it. I need to get up early to make breakfast and feed you two hungry men. He sighed at that. Is Willard going to eat every meal with us forever? Until he finds a wife, he will. He's my brother, and I'm not going to let him eat his own cooking. I got sick once, and he cooked for me for a week. I've never eaten so many disgusting concoctions in my entire life. All right. He dropped a kiss on her nose, and she immediately shifted until their lips met. You missed, she whispered against his lips, her hands stroking his bare shoulders. He laughed. I didn't miss at all. I just thought it would be easier to ease you into it. No need to ease me into anything. She took his hand and placed it on her breast. I think it's time to get this show on the road. You, my sweet wife, are awfully demanding. I guess I should have known who'd wear the pants in this family. Well, for now, it's both of us, but I don't think that makes it so I'm in charge. We'll be in charge together. Making decisions together is the way to have a good marriage, in my opinion. Well, I think we'll have a better marriage if you just close your eyes and enjoy yourself for a few minutes. No decisions need to be made. We just need to feel. She wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed herself closer to him. Is that so? It is so. She wriggled closer, but said nothing else for a long while. Afterward, she lay with her head on his shoulder again, her hand toying with the light covering of hair on his chest. That wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it would be. A ringing endorsement from my new wife. Tomorrow night we'll shoot 4, not half bad. By the time we've been married for a week, I expect to hear, that was wonderful. Can we do it again? Is that understood? She laughed. You earn it, and I'll say it. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Sleep, my wife. We need to work tomorrow. He lay beside her, thinking about the pleasure she'd brought him. He definitely needed to get better at it, because he was going to want that a lot. No, that's not it at all. If I run into him, it won't be a big deal. He was in my past, but he's no longer in my life. Why are you nervous then? He asked, not understanding. Because I've been deceiving the good people of Weston for 3 years now. I'm afraid they'll remember that and hate me. Frankie looked down at her hands nervously, fidgeting in her chair. I really don't know what to expect, but I don't expect anyone to come up to me and tell me what a great joke it was that I played on them all. I guess not. Well, either way, you'll have my full support. Once they were on their way to town, she was surprised how good it felt to be sitting beside her handsome husband, wearing a dress. Yes, the pants she'd grown used to were a great deal more comfortable, but the dress made her feel feminine for a change. When they reached the mercantile in town, Wally parked the wagon and reached up for her, grabbing her waist and lifting her down. She smiled up at him. I think you're just supposed to take my hand to help me down, she said softly. I like doing things my way. I get to touch you more. I like it too. Her voice was soft, and she looked around her hoping no one had overheard. He offered his arm, and she took it, walking into the store with him. She immediately walked back to the yard goods and looked through several different prints of calico. Francine. I'm surprised to see you in town 2 days in a row. And in the same dress. Have you fallen into poverty? Reginald asked from behind her. Of course not. She turned away from the man she now considered odious and went back to choosing the fabric. Which do you like, Wally? Her voice was soft and sweet. Wally frowned at the 2 different fabrics. I like the mint green. It matches your eyes. And I think I like the lavender. Then you'll match how Mabel looked on that special day. Reginald looked back and forth between the newlyweds. Have you been married before as well, Wally? No, I haven't. Wally refused to say anything else. The man seemed to be following them. After Frankie chose the 2 fabrics she wanted for dresses, they moved on to the yarn. She chose a very bright shade of red and an equally vibrant shade of blue for her brother's socks. Go ahead and choose 4 of 5 colors for socks. I'll choose for your scarf and gloves. Are you actually going to sew and knit yourself? Reginald asked, his voice full of surprise. My mother taught me to sew and knit from a very young age. I can also cook. Mother said if our husbands ever fell on hard times, we'd be able to feed and clothe our families anyway. She and Wally wandered to the dry goods, and she chose some flour and sugar. We didn't have a wedding cake last night, so I thought I could make a cake tomorrow. You do like sweets, don't you? Love them, Wally replied. I just wish there was a dessert as sweet as my wife. She laughed softly, her eyes meeting his. She knew she was pretending to some extent, because she had a need for Reginald to believe she was very much in love with her husband. After they'd chosen everything they needed, she gave the note her brother had written to Mr. Larson, the owner of the mercantile. My brother and I have a need for a hired hand. Would you mind posting that on your bulletin board? Not at all, miss. You know me. I'm Frankie Weston, she said softly, hoping Reginald wouldn't hear. Wait, Frankie? You're a man. She smiled tightly at Mr. Larson, knowing his voice had carried throughout the store. I felt the need to disguise myself, but now that I've married, I'm happy to be known as a woman again. She gestured to the wagon outside the front door. If you'd be kind enough to load our purchases, my husband and I will be on our way to the diner. I haven't eaten another woman's cooking in a very long time, and I'd like to rectify that. Without looking behind her to see if Reginald had heard her, she walked toward the door, her hand on Wally's arm. As soon as they were outside, Wally looked down at her. He's getting to you. He's making me angry. He has no right to come out here and follow me around everywhere. I've moved on with my life, and it's time he realized it. She stopped in front of the diner and waited while Wally opened the door for her. It wasn't long before they were seated and had ordered their lunch. Reginald came in and sat at the table beside them, watching them as he sipped at a cup of coffee but ordering nothing. Once they'd eaten, Frankie reached out and grasped Wally's hand, giving him the money she had intended to pay for the meal with. She didn't want Wally to be embarrassed of his wife paying, but more importantly, she didn't want Reginald to see her pay. She didn't need him to draw any conclusions about who wore the pants in her family, especially now that he heard she'd been running around disguised as a man. She felt her old beau's eyes on her as she left the diner, still clinging to Wally's arm. "Take me home. I can't wait to spend the afternoon, just the two of us." Wally watched her but said nothing. He knew she was uncomfortable around her old beau, but he didn't like the way she felt the need to pretend there was more between them than there was. What was Reginald still doing in town anyway? He should have been on a train to New York by now. He'd have to talk to Willard about the situation. Maybe his brother-in-law would have some answers. Chapter 8. Frankie and Wally went for a long walk that afternoon, and she showed him all her favorite places on the ranch. They stopped at the huge pine tree in the front yard first. It was over 7 feet tall. "I love this tree. Every year Willard asks me if I want him to cut it down and bring it into the house, because he knows I consider it the perfect Christmas tree, and every year I tell him we need to leave it in the yard, so it can continue to grow and our children can enjoy it as well. I string popcorn for it, and the birds all eat it." As she said it, she thought that it might be nice if she made him a special ornament for the tree that year, and she decided that she would do just that. As they walked, she talked about what it was like when they first arrived in the summer of 1889. They'd lived in a small tent as they'd worked all day every day to build first her house and then one for him. As soon as she'd had a kitchen to cook in and a room to sleep in, they'd started on his cabin. The stable had been the third building to be built, and then the small barn. The cattle hadn't really come until the spring of 1890, because they had taken the whole winter to clear as many trees from their main area as they could. She was proud of the work they'd done on the ranch, and proud that her hands had helped to do it. "You seem to be very happy here," he said. She nodded emphatically. "I am. I'm ready for children though." "I guess that's where I come in," he said, winking at her and making her blush. "I think that would be the case." She rested her head against his shoulder for a moment as they walked on further down by the river. She knew that's where Willard was working, so she deliberately walked as far from the area her brother would be in as possible. She just had to be close to the river with her new husband, because it was the most romantic spot on the ranch. It just wasn't possible to take a romantic walk when she was constantly running into her elder brother. "And I know I'm also here to help with the chores. And for me, I needed the companionship." He looked at her with surprise. "You did?" "Of course I did. This marriage wasn't self-sacrificing. I was ready to not be alone all winter long. I'd hoped we'd marry by Christmas, and we beat Christmas by 6 weeks." He smiled. "What does my beautiful bride want for Christmas?" She shrugged, blushing a little. "I don't know." "Yes, you do. I can see it on your face." "Well, I'd love to know we were expecting our first baby by Christmas time. Don't you think that would be a perfect gift for both of us?" "I would like that as well. Maybe we should have gotten you some extra yarn so you could knit little booties." She grinned. "You know, I thought about that, but I'd be afraid that starting on them would make it harder for us to conceive. I'm willing to do what it takes to have a baby on the way by Christmas. You can count on me." Frankie laughed, blushing. "You need to stop teasing me, Wallace Weston." "Wallace Weston. You know, I'm surprised at how much I like the sound of that." I do have a question, though. What's that? In your letter you said you wanted a man who was willing to take the Weston last name, and I had no problem understanding that. What I don't understand is that you wanted a man with a given name that started with W. Why was that? It's a tradition in my family that all men have names starting with W: Willard, Wellesley, Walton, Walter, Ward, you get the idea. So I wanted to have a man whose first name started with a W, so he'd do well with the other Weston men. I'm glad you didn't have to change your first name. I think that's why my sister thought of me first when she read your letter. Frankie stopped walking, looking up at him. I'm glad she thought of you. I'm starting to have feelings for you, Wally. He smiled down at her. I have a whole lot of feelings for you already. It wasn't his words so much as the way he said them that made her blush. She loved being a newlywed. Asterisk. 2 weeks later, Frankie was in the kitchen wearing one of the new dresses she'd made and just about to drop dumplings into a pot of chicken and broth. She had never made chicken and dumplings, but she'd gotten the recipe from a new friend at church, and she was eager to try it. There was a pounding at the door, and she grabbed the revolver that always stayed with her while the men were out on the ranch. Tucking it into the pocket of her apron, she went to the door, opening it cautiously. Reginald stood in front of her. I thought I'd find you home. Is there something you need? She wanted to ask why he was still in Idaho, but she knew that would be too rude. Her mother would be disgusted with her for as rude as she'd already been. I just want to talk to you. May I come in? She shook her head, stepping outside, keeping her hand on the pistol in her pocket. Tell me why you're here. I just want to apologize for how things ended between us. When I knew Catherine was pregnant, I should have come to you and told you myself instead of letting you hear it from someone else. Yes, you should have. She wasn't going to give him an inch. She wanted nothing to do with him ever again. I've always regretted how I treated you. I feel awful for it. Will you forgive me? Frankie sighed. Truthfully, there's nothing to forgive. I've moved on. I'm married now, quite happily I may add. I don't care what happened all those years ago, and I certainly don't need you here reminding me of how stupid I was. He frowned. You weren't stupid. I figured someday I'd move west with you and we'd have a place like this together. Then I find out you have a ranch out here with your brother. I couldn't stay in town with everyone whispering behind my back. You hurt me. I've grown up, and I'm over it. I'm happy now. I'd appreciate it if you went right back to New York, where you came from. Reginald eyed her shrewdly. I will if you tell me how you met your husband. No one had ever heard of him until you married him, and he took your last name instead of the other way around. That doesn't happen. So how'd you end up married to him? That's really none of your business, Reginald. I met him, we courted, and we married. That's all you really need to know. She still stood on the steps, and over his head she saw Wally and Willard approaching. She wasn't sure if she was thankful they were coming to get him away from her, or worried about Wally being upset that she was talking to him alone. She knew Wally didn't trust him even a little bit. Her brother walked up on one side of him, and Wally went to the other. Why are you here, White? Willard asked, his voice deceptively soft. Frankie could hear the threat in it. I had to apologize for my bad behavior to Francine. I hoped I could talk her into running off with me, but she claims to be happily married. Frankie hardened her jaw. I'm going to go inside and finish making supper while you men take care of the refuse. She immediately went inside, slamming the door behind her. She didn't care what they did with him. She dropped the dumplings into the boiling broth and covered the pot. Now supper would be late, thanks to Reginald. The man needed to get out of her life and stay out of it. She was serving the chicken and dumplings into 3 bowls when the door opened behind her. She didn't bother to turn. Francine, we need to talk about him. Wally's voice was quiet, but he was much too serious for her tastes. She sighed heavily. After supper. I refused to air our dirty laundry in front of my brother. There was nothing to air, of course, but she worried that Wally wouldn't think that. 5 minutes later, Willard came into the house, taking a deep sniff of the air. Something smells good. When did you learn to cook this, Frankie? She shrugged. Wally mentioned one of his favorite meals was chicken and dumplings, so I asked Mary, my new friend at church. She wrote down the recipe for me, and I decided to try it tonight. I thought my new husband would appreciate it if I got a little more inventive in the kitchen. Wally frowned at her. Of course, I appreciate it. It smells wonderful. Once they'd prayed, Wally took his first bite, sighing with contentment. My sister Elizabeth was always the one with a knack for making chicken and dumplings in our house. I thought she was the best cook of all my sisters, but then she moved away. She invited me to supper after she got your letter, and I have to admit, I'd hoped she was making chicken and dumplings for me, but she didn't. That's too bad, Willard responded. These are 10 times better than Elizabeth's ever were. Your dumplings are perfect, Francine. Thank you for making the effort to learn to cook something new for me. She simply nodded. She wanted to say so much, but Willard was there, and she would wait until he was gone. I told him to go back to New York and not show his face here again, Willard suddenly put in, eating a bite of the chicken. I'm going to write to Father as well. I'm certain his parents don't realize he's here causing trouble. Will they do something about it? Wally asked. What can they do? He's an adult. He's also their heir. They can threaten his inheritance, and nothing matters more to Reginald than money. I'm sure he'll go home after his father sends for him. He won't risk missing out on money. Is his family wealthy? Wally asked, feeling stupid as soon as the words left his mouth. Of course he was stupid. Why would her wealthy parents have approved of him as an escort for their daughter otherwise? Willard shrugged. Not nearly as wealthy as our family, but they do pretty well for themselves. As soon as she was finished eating, Frankie carried the rest of the pot of chicken and dumplings to the cellar, with the lid still on it. She wanted to be able to reheat it the following day. The meal had been easier than she'd expected to prepare, but she wouldn't cook it terribly often, so she'd make a lot when she made it. She noticed Willard was already gone when she got back to the kitchen, but she said nothing as she started doing the dishes. She was angry. Her husband didn't seem to trust her, and he wanted to berate her for someone else's actions. Well, she wasn't going to make it easy for him. Francine, the dishes can wait. Talk to me for a minute. When the dishes are done. She had never promised to obey him, and he couldn't expect it from her now. She'd told him how it would be. Waiting to do the dishes wasn't something she wanted to do, so she wouldn't do it. Wally sighed and walked over to help her with the dishes. She'd be done faster with help, and he wanted to get to the talking portion of the evening. Why was she acting so prickly over everything? Had she wanted to leave with the other man? When the dishes were all done and put away, and she'd wiped down the table and swept under it, she finally sat down with him. She folded her hands in her lap serenely, hoping he wouldn't notice how white her knuckles were. She wanted to scream and throw things at his head for not immediately trusting her, and it was taking everything inside her to act like the lady she'd been raised to be. Why was Wally here? She shrugged. He said he wanted to apologize for his bad behavior in New York. And did you accept his apology? I've moved on. I told him I didn't need him or his apology. A slow smile spread across Wally's face. Of course you did. You're amazing. She gaped at him for a moment, blinking rapidly. What did you just say? I said you're amazing. You once thought yourself in love with that man, but you consistently tell him to go away. You're content with where you are in life, and you're doing nothing to try to rekindle an old flame with him. Why would I? He married a girl who had made fun of me for years, after impregnating her, all the while escorting me to every function. The man is less to me than a slug, and I want nothing to do with him ever again. She shook her head. I doubt if his wife and son are dead. They're probably waiting for him to come back to New York, and he thinks he can sweet-talk me into his bed. It's not happening. There's only one man I want touching me that way, and it's certainly not him. His smile grew. Oh really? Who do you want touching you that way then? She frowned at him. Only you, and you know it. Then come over here and show me. He caught her hand and pulled her onto his lap, his mouth lowering to press his lips to hers. You're some woman, Mrs. Weston. I think I'm going to keep you. She wrinkled her nose. There was a doubt? Not in my mind. You've made me a very happy man, you know. Really? Then why did I see doubt on your face when you walked up to the house earlier? You didn't trust that I was true, did you? I did. It was never you I didn't trust. It was him. I can't figure out why he's still here and hasn't gone back to New York, where he belongs. Frankie sighed. I wish I knew. I think we've talked about him enough. I want to work on your Christmas wish. My Christmas wish? She blushed when she realized what he was talking about, running her hands over his shoulders. I think I can comply with that. He leaned down and scraped his teeth across the skin on the side of her neck, knowing how she'd respond. Do we want a boy or a girl first? She turned more fully into his arms. Does it even matter? I plan on having a half dozen of each. Chapter 9. In early December, Frankie couldn't resist going for a walk in the fresh fallen snow. She loved to go down to the river and see it with the snow all around it. She'd finished all her work for the day except cooking supper, and she had a huge pot of stew on the stove already. Bread was waiting to be put in the oven, so she could serve it still warm with the stew. As she walked, she dreamed. She could picture herself in 5 years with 3 children, a little blonde-haired, green-eyed girl like her, a boy with dark hair and brown eyes, and maybe a baby with a dimpled chin. She sighed, liking the picture. In 10 years, they could be playing outside during the first snowfall, sledding and building a fort from the snow. She loved to think of the future of not only her, but the ranch. Someday she knew the ranch would be huge and make people very happy. She didn't know how, but she knew it would happen. When she returned to the house, she stopped short just before she reached the front step. There, lying on the step, was a single rose. Where had Wally found such a thing? She'd thought they were working all day. She sniffed deeply and took it to put it in a vase in the middle of the table. She ran water into a vase and stuck the rose in, but when she turned to the table, she saw something else. A jeweler's box, and inside was a pearl necklace. She touched each pearl lightly with the tip of her index finger. How had Wally gotten the money for them? And why hadn't he waited until Christmas to give them to her? That was too big of a gift for just any day. She would wait until after supper to ask him, because she wanted to be alone with him. Perhaps he'd tell her he loved her. The love she felt for him grew every day, but she had yet to tell him, preferring to wait until he told her first. The necklace was a perfect present to go along with a declaration of love. Supper was on the table when the men walked in, and Wally dropped a kiss on her lips before turning to wash his hands at the sink. Frankie put a fresh loaf of bread on the table and sat down across from her brother, her gaze resting on the beautiful rose for a moment. I thought stew would be nice, because of how cold it is. Willard smiled, nodding. You know I always appreciate your stew. He took a huge bite. Wally's gaze was on the flower. Where did that rose come from? Frankie frowned at him. You left it on the doorstep for me while I was out walking by the river. It's beautiful. Thank you so much. Why was he pretending it wasn't from him? It had to be. Wally shook his head slowly. I was with Willard all day. We were moving the herd to a portion of the land that didn't get quite as much snowfall. They'd also stacked some hay to make windbreaks and put out some extra feed. There was a pond the cattle drank from there, and they had broken the ice. That would be a daily thing until spring. But, who? As she asked, the answer came to her. Reginald. The man was becoming more than a pest. You didn't bring me the necklace either, did you? She suddenly felt as if the thing was alive, and she wanted to tear it off. Necklace? Wally asked, his eyes growing cold. A flower was a lot for another man's wife, but a necklace? That was going too far. Someone needed to do something about Reginald White. It was on the table after my walk. She reached behind her neck to unclasp the necklace and hand it to him. I thought it was from you, or I'd have never put it on. He turned the necklace over in his hand. It's beautiful. I'm sorry, Frankie whispered, embarrassed to have this happen in front of her brother. I had no idea. I'm going to go and have a talk with him. He has no business even staying in Idaho. He's staying at the boarding house in town, and I think it's time he went back to New York. He put the necklace into his pants pocket, planning to take it back and throw it at the other man, if he could resist strangling him with it. It's not up to you to talk to him. I'll do it. Frankie took a bite of her stew, her gaze level on his. No, I need to deal with this. I'll thank you to remember that I spent 3 years making my own decisions. I don't need a man to watch over me or protect me. How could he have forgotten how strongly she felt about this? Wally rubbed his hand over the back of his neck, something he only did when he was frustrated. Willard, will you tell her it's my place to talk to the man? It won't do any good. She's got in her head that she doesn't want you to do it, so if you do, she's only going to be furious. Wally closed his eyes, counting to 10 slowly before he opened them. He should have known his brother-in-law would stay out of it. He'd made it very clear from the very beginning that he was going to stay neutral. I don't want to fight with you about this, Francine. I want to fight with him about this. Don't you dare go into town and speak with him. It's my place to deal with this, and I will deal with it. You will not. Do you hear me? She got up from the table, making a great deal of noise as she started the dishes. Willard just kept eating, acting as if nothing was going on around him. Asterisk. Frankie sat quietly beside her husband and her brother at church 2 days later. She and Wally had barely spoken since their fight about who should be the one to talk to Reginald. As they were singing, she shared a hymnal with Wally, and she noticed the knuckles of his right hand were bloody. She hadn't been willing to look at him closely enough to notice that the night before. She looked at his face and saw the corner of his mouth was scabbed over as well. Looking over her shoulder, she spotted Reginald sitting alone at the back of the church, one of his eyes black, and his lips split open and scabbed over. She was shaking, she was so angry. Why? She hissed at her husband. He shook his head, refusing to respond to her accusations in church. Of course, her assumption was absolutely correct, and he had come into town the day before and threatened the other man. When his threats hadn't worked, he'd used his fists. After the service was over, Frankie moved away from her husband and made a beeline for Mary, the widow that ran the boarding house there in town. They had become friends since her marriage to Wally, and she would know exactly who had started the fight between her husband and her former beau. When Frankie got to Mary, the young woman frowned. She'd only been married a year when her husband had been bitten by a rattlesnake and died, leaving her with only her house to her name. She'd made the most of it and turned her skills for cooking and cleaning into a profitable business, rather than immediately marrying one of the local men who had asked for her hand. She'd told Frankie she needed time to mourn before she could even think of remarrying. Did Wally seek out Reginald? Or the other way around? I'd like to be able to tell you the fight was started by Mr. White, because I can see from the look on your face that's what you want to hear. But it's not true. Wally came into town yesterday, and he pounded on the front door of my house. When I answered, he walked in past me, and straight into the parlor where Mr. White was sitting. He grabbed him up by his collar and hit him right in the eye. They did some serious damage to my parlor before they were done. Frankie sighed. How much do I owe you for the damages? Mr. White gave me $100 after the fight was over. He stood staring at the door after Wally had left, and he grinned. I'm happy to say it hurt his lip when he did so. He looked positively gleeful that he'd made your husband mad enough to hit him. Thank you for the information. Frankie was certain $100 was a great deal more than the damages had come to, so she wasn't worried about that. I'm very sorry for the fight in your house. I assure you, it will not be happening again. Mary put her hand on Frankie's arm. Frankie, don't be so hard on him. He was just trying to get rid of that pesky man. I know, but I told him I would handle it. Does he think me incapable of taking care of my own problems? Who does he think fought my fights for me while I spent 3 years dressed as a man? Mary shrugged. It's in their nature. You can't hold it against him for long. Frankie hugged her friend, knowing she wouldn't be holding anything against her husband for a while, especially her person. Thank you for the information. Now I'm going to go home and deal with my husband. As Mary watched Frankie stalk away, she whispered, God save him. Asterisk. Wally watched Frankie the whole way home from church. Willard drove, and Frankie sat between the two men, her hands folded in her lap, and she stared down at her hands demurely. Well, at least it looked like she was staring demurely, but he knew she was really furious, so she was really staring in anger. He sighed. She didn't even look at him. I liked the Reverend's message of forgiveness this morning, Willard said, to no one in particular. It's true that people do things that bother us all the time, but if we love them, then we need to forget it happened. Love covers a multitude of sins. Yes, sir, it was a good sermon. I thought it was good, Wally said, knowing she was getting angrier with each word spoken. Did Willard not know Frankie at all? He knew his brother-in-law meant well, but really, the words were like putting a bullseye on Wally's forehead. Frankie sat quietly, and not another word was spoken as they pulled onto the ranch. Frankie had put a pot roast in first thing that morning, so she walked into the house, pulled it from the oven, set the table, and sat down, serving herself. Willard sat down and served himself as well, watching the married couple carefully. I think I'm going to spend the afternoon napping in my cabin, he announced before forking up a big bite of meat. Frankie still hadn't spoken when she'd finished the dishes, and she took her gun and a box of bullets outside. She heard Wally follow her, and that was just fine with her. She couldn't prove her point if he wasn't looking. She marched out to her practice area, a target painted onto the trunk of one of the tall oak trees on the edge of the property. She efficiently loaded her pistol, cocked it, and held her right hand straight out in front of her, her left hand holding the wrist of the right, before pulling the trigger. A piece of bark from the bullseye jumped off the tree, and she pulled back to cock the gun once more. 7 times she shot, and 7 times she hit her mark. When she was finished, she put her gun into the pocket of her apron and turned to her husband, her arms folded across her chest and a spark of fire in her eye. Do I shoot as well as you do? He nodded. From what I can see, you shoot as well as any man in the whole country. He'd never seen a woman shoot like that. Heck, he'd never seen a man shoot like that. Do I seem to you like a woman who would face a man she didn't trust without a weapon? I saw you talking to him with no weapon just a few weeks ago. I know you would talk to him without being armed. You saw me talking to him. Did you also see me wearing this apron that day? Why did he think she was stupid? Because she had breasts, or because she didn't have a penis? Well, yes, but you didn't have your gun. Frankie took a step closer to him. She had to tilt her head way back to be able to see his face, but she had no problem doing that. He had a full foot on her in height, but she backed down from no one. I had my gun. I was ready for anyone or anything to be at that door. I'm a strong, independent woman, and the next time you treat me like a child, I'll do more than show you I know how to shoot, Wallace Weston. I'll have you know that I am very capable of taking care of myself and everyone around me. I would shoot a man who tried to hurt me or anyone I loved. So you just think about that the next time you decide to go into town and use your fists. I can take care of myself. Wally stared after her as she walked away from him, wondering why the fight with her had made him feel so much. He chased after her, catching up with her and grabbing her arm. I'm sorry, Frankie. I promise I won't do anything that stupid again. She stood staring at him, feeling the anger slowly leave her body. Thank you for admitting to your stupidity. Every man should do that. He couldn't help but grin at the insult. Only his wife could say something like that to him without angering him. I was stupid. And I might be stupid in some other way again in the future, but I believe in learning from my mistakes. I won't do that particular dumb thing again. She sighed. Thank God. I wouldn't want to have to shoot you, but I would. He laughed, catching her hips and pulling her close to him. Have I ever told you that your eyes spark when you get angry, and you look even more beautiful than usual? Have I ever told you that there are days when I want to kick you so hard you'll never walk again? He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. I'm very impressed at your shooting, Mrs. Weston. We should have a shooting contest sometime. She smiled, wrapping her arms around his neck. You know, that would interest me a great deal. You don't cry when you lose, do you? Having so many brothers and sisters taught me to be a gracious winner and loser. I can do both equally well. He was a crack shot himself, but he wasn't sure that he could outshoot her. Who taught you to shoot? She shrugged. I told you my mother believed that her daughters should be able to cook, clean, sew, knit, and crochet. My father thought we should be able to protect ourselves. I've been shooting like that since I was 13. Don't cross me, Wally Weston. He knew their crisis was over, because she was calling him Wally again. I will do my very best. See that you do. Chapter 10. 2 weeks before Christmas, Frankie was sitting at the table carving a special ornament for Wally for their Christmas tree. She'd made one that said, Our First Christmas 1892, and now she was carving a buck. She knew she had a lot of skills that weren't exactly womanly, but they were useful, and she wasn't going to pretend to be a wilting flower, simply because they might make a man uncomfortable. Fortunately, Wally seemed to be proud of all of her accomplishments, as long as she wore a dress while practicing them. She loved him more with every passing day, and she knew she was carrying his baby. She was already 2 weeks late, and she was never late. She was starting to work on another dress that could be let out in the waist later. She had just finished carving the buck, and was on her way to the bedroom to get some paint to finish it, when there was a knock at the front door. She put her pistol into her apron pocket and opened it, wondering who was there. Reginald. Go home. Where you are is home for me. I'm not going anywhere. She sighed. Why don't you understand that I don't want you here? He had always spoken to her in the same way. It was as if he'd read entire volumes of books on how to woo a woman, and he used everything he'd learned in every conversation. She'd once thought it was romantic, but now she just wanted to shoot him. I heard that you got angry with your husband for picking a fight with me. You do care about me, whether you want to admit it or not. Do you want to know why I got angry with my husband? Her voice was deceptively soft for the anger she was feeling. She was quite proud of herself for making it sound that way. Soon, he would realize just how angry she was. Reginald nodded, his face smug. Because you still have feelings for me. She laughed. No. Because I can take care of myself. I don't need a man hovering over me trying to keep me safe. I can keep myself safe. One day the world would realize that women were just as capable as men were. She couldn't wait for that day to come. Just because you dressed as a man for 3 years doesn't mean you know how to protect yourself. She shook her head. No, it doesn't. She pulled the pistol from the apron she wore and cocked it. This means I know how to take care of myself. She carefully took aim. I'm going to shoot a branch off the tree hanging over your buggy. His borrowed buggy. If it had been his, she'd have shot the buggy to demonstrate her skill. He laughed softly. Sure you are. She pulled the trigger, a branch falling atop his buggy. Now, get in your buggy and take yourself right back to New York. If I see you again, I won't be aiming for branches. I'll put a bullet through your shoulder. He took a step back. That was a fluke. You didn't hit the branch you were aiming for. She cocked the pistol again, aiming it straight at him. It wasn't a fluke. And I've never in my life cocked my gun and not shot it. If you move quickly, this will be the first time. She prayed he would hurry, because she wanted nothing more than to put a bullet through his shoulder. She'd never shot anyone, but at that moment, she wanted to do nothing else. Why? You know you love me. He was slowly backing away as he asked the question. Love you? I've never loved you. I love my husband. She watched as he turned and ran for his buggy, sorry to see him go. Moving target practice might be interesting. I'm not coming back. If you reject me now, I'll go straight home to New York. Catherine's parents want me to marry her sister. As long as you're not in Idaho, I don't care what you do. Get off my property before I shoot you for trespassing. He drove off quickly, heading for the road. She knew he wouldn't be back. Reginald had always been a bit of a coward, which she'd been willing to overlook at 17. At 21, she had no desire to overlook a single one of his flaws. Never again. Asterisk. Willard froze when he heard the gunshot. That sounded like it came from the house. Wally was already running for his horse. They were out checking on the herd, making sure they were all healthy, and they were much too far from the house. He was on his horse and riding home before Willard had time to say another word. When he reached the house, he threw his leg over the back of the horse, dismounting. Frankie was standing on the front porch, her gun still in her hand. Frankie? Are you okay? Did someone hurt you? Frankie glared at her husband. How long had she stood there, imagining putting a bullet through Reginald? She had no idea, but obviously long enough for him to come back from where he'd been working. How many times do I have to tell you I can take care of myself? Reginald is gone. I sent him back to New York. She felt a tear escape her eye then. Are you sad that he left? Are you all right? Why was she crying? Hadn't she wanted Reginald to leave? He couldn't understand what exactly was wrong with her, so he could fix it. No, I'm not sad that he left, you fool. I'm sad that I just shouted at him that I love you. I should have told you first, not that lying sack of dung. She knew it wasn't the right way to tell her man she loved him, but when she thought back to his proposal, maybe it wasn't so bad. Wally walked toward her, carefully removing the pistol from her hand and putting the safety on. You love me? He asked softly, knowing that those words from her would make all his wishes come true. She nodded. I do love you. I love you so much. Throwing herself into his arms, she knocked him backward into the snow, landing on top of him and covering his face with kisses. When Willard rode up to them a moment later, he shook his head. It's awful cold to be kissing in the snow. You realize you have a bed inside for that kind of thing, right? Frankie pulled her mouth away from her husband's for long enough to say, "Go away, big brother. We're kissing here." "I see that." Willard shook his head and rode off back to the herd. "Wally, take the rest of the day off, would you? I don't want to have to put up with your ugly face anymore today." Frankie laughed. She rolled to Wally's side and got to her feet, brushing the snow off her dress. There was a great deal more on him than there was on her, so she then helped him brush the snow off of his back, her hands lingering where they would. She took his hand and led him toward the house, stopping short before opening the door. "You can't come in yet. Give me 1 minute." He frowned. "You keeping secrets from me, woman?" She shook her head. "A week before Christmas is the time to be keeping secrets, don't you think?" He smiled as she disappeared inside. She was something else. When he'd imagined himself married, it was to a petite little woman who said, "Yes, sir," whenever he gave an order. God must have laughed at that when he prayed for a wife. He'd gotten exactly what he needed with Francine. Frankie hid the ornament in her mending basket and hurried back to the door. She took his hand and pulled him inside. "I'm glad we have a little extra time today, because I want to give you an early Christmas present." An early present? In his family, there had been one present per person, and it was usually something like a pair of socks or mittens. A necessity that was masked as a gift. He'd always been grateful. He knew some of his siblings had wanted toys or frivolities for Christmas, but why? Having warm clothes and enough to eat was all anyone could really ask for. She nodded, her face glowing. "You'll get other gifts on Christmas morning, of course. But this one is special, and I just can't wait." "What is it?" he asked, a line between his brows as he drew them together. She smiled, taking his hand and putting it over her still flat abdomen. "We're expecting." His eyes grew wide and he grabbed her, lifting her off her feet and spinning her in a circle. "A baby." She laughed happily. "It's the one thing I really wanted, and it's happening. If it's a boy, I want to call him Wilbur. If it's a girl, I want to call her Roberta. Bobby for short. I've always loved that name." "Bobby?" He wrinkled his nose. "I'm not so sure about naming a girl Bobby, but Wilbur works. We can call him Will or Willie." "That works for me." She sighed contentedly, resting her cheek on his shoulder. "I do love you, Wally." He cupped her face in his hands, kissing her softly. "I love you with everything inside me, Frankie. I'm glad my sister chose you for me." She smiled. "Would you have chosen me for yourself?" He thought about it for a moment before slowly shaking his head. "I don't think I would have. I would have seen you and been afraid of your strength. I would have wanted a woman who would need me to be strong for her, not find her own strength from within." "But you're happy now?" He nodded, putting one arm under her knees and scooping her up into his arms, carrying her into the bedroom. "I couldn't be happier. Thank you, Francine Weston, for being what I didn't know I needed." She sighed, resting her cheek against his shoulder. "Thank you for being willing to let me be who I am and not trying to change me."